understand the customer requirement, it is more from a customer's perspective they are telling. It is not from a process perspective. So as a project team, what we do is we define the customer requirement to a process requirement. So that is the second step that we do. So we define something called as critical to quality, or CTQ, which is specific and measurable critical process requirement. So a translation metric is used to translate what the customer said to a process requirement. For example, like when we ask the customer what is the problem they are facing from our process, they may say that it takes too long to receive my product. So that is called as a VOC, the customer verbatim, through a survey or through a feedback or through a interview. We are trying to understand what the customer requirement. So the customer will always tell in their language, so it's say too long to receive my product. So where the project team understand where is the problem in the process. So the problem is in the timeliness in the getting the customer order on time to the customer. So timeliness is the issue that we have, the quality issue or the service issue that we have in the timeliness of the process. So we ask the customer, when we say too long, how much time can you wait and how much minimum and the maximum time that you can wait for the product to be received. So we ask those specific need statement from the customer, and from the customer we get this statement. So the customer says, I want a product to be delivered within 60 days after I send an order. I'm willing to wait for a minimum of 30 days. So this is the specific need statement the project team gets from the customer when the customers are telling this is they're taking too long to receive the product. So we try to see what is the specific need statement from the customers, and we try to see what majority of the customers are telling. So that becomes our specific need statement from the customers. And when the customers are saying they're willing to wait for 30 days and maximum of 60 days, that becomes our upper and lower specification limits. So 30 days becomes our lower specification limit, and 60 days becomes the upper specification limit. So the customer specific need statement will help us to define the specification limits from the customer's perspective. Now we know that, okay, this is what the customer need. The customer need a product to be delivered within 60 days after they send an order. But how we can measure it from the process, that is something that we have to look into, a specific and measurable critical process requirement, something that I can measure from the process. So the project teams identify that, measure, and call that as a critical to quality measure, or CTQ measure. In this example, we can say it's the order fulfillment time is a measure that I can measure from the process and say that is the fulfillment is taking more than 60 days, or it is within 30 days to 60 days. So that is how we can measure this timeliness from the process and see if the customer VOCs or specific need statements are met or the process. So the CTQs are able to define if the process can meet the customer requirement or process is able to meet the customer requirement or not. So VOC is from a customer's perspective, the need of the customer. CTQ is a measure from the process which is related to VOC. So how we can measure the VOC from the process is called as CTQ. How we can measure the VOC. So which measure from the process can we can identify the VOC is called as a CTQ measure. So it's a specific and measurable critical process requirement. So order fulfillment time is CTQ here. So then we define the process where we are doing the project using SIPOC. So in this SIPOC, we are writing the order fulfillment process. So SIPOC is called as a macro level process map: suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. So SIPOC help us to define the process in which we have the problem or the customer requirement is not being met. We define that process where we have the problem using a macro level process map. Why it is called as a macro level process map is we define the process steps in 5 to 7 steps. So in 5 to 7 steps, we have to define the process. So in this, let us say the customers are external customers, and what do they need is they need a product to be delivered. So delivered product is the output. And how do we define it? So the project team define the first step and the last step using an oval shape, or we call it ellipse shape. We say flow chart notations. So receive the order. So we first receive the order from the customer, and lastly we dispatch the product to the customers. So once we receive the order, there's a team to study the requirement. Then we procure the materials, make the product, do the quality check, and pack the product and dispatch the product. So this is how the process is defined in flowchart. So in a macro level process map or a SIPOC, we only write 5 to 7 steps. So maximum is 7, minimum is 5. So in 5 to 7 steps, we have to define the process in a SIPOC. So corresponding to each process step, we write the inputs. So we look into each process steps and write what is the inputs required in each process steps. So here we are trying, as a project team, we brainstorm on for receiving the order, we need the order details, and the checklists are required to study the requirement. Standard operating procedures are required. So for procure the materials, we need the material list, the vendor list. Equipments are required to make the product. Raw materials are required. To do the quality check and the packing the products, we need packing materials, executives, quality inspectors, managers. For dispatching the product, we need transportation vehicles. So we try to see what are those inputs required. So inputs can be materials, resources, and data. So even the people who are required in the process can be given as an input here. That's why you can see materials, resources, and data can be the input to any process. And who gives the inputs are going to be suppliers. So order details are given by the external suppliers. You can see that customer may also become the supplier for some inputs. Checklist of standard operating procedures may be given by production department. Procurement departments also may give those material lists or the equipments. The vendor list. Equipments or raw materials or packing materials will be given by vendors. Recruitment team may give the executives, quality inspectors, managers. Transportation vehicles are taken care by logistic department. So who supplies the input is the supplier. So people who supplies the input are the inputs. Suppliers. Inputs are materials, resources, and data required for the process. Process, what is written is a series of steps which transforms one or more input and give an output, which is value to customers. Output is a product or a service which is used by the customers, and the customers are the external customer who is going to benefit from the process. So this is how a SIPOC is written. For every process, we can write a SIPOC. So every process, we write a macro level. What is the process being followed by the process? Where the problem is, the problem will be in the output. So the problem in the output will be because of the problem in the process, problem in the inputs, the problem in the suppliers. So that is where we define in a macro level who are the suppliers, what are the inputs required in the process, what are the process steps, what is output from the process, and who is a customer from the process. So that is how a SIPOC is written. So it is called as defining the process, the third deliverable. Once we define the VOC by understanding the customer requirement, the voice of the customers, we define the CTQ, or critical to quality, by defining the process requirement. And third deliverable is we define the process where we have a problem, where we are going to do an improvement